All right, so I had so many ideas today. A lot of what I was doing today was rebuilding a lot of the stuff that was lost in the computer crash, but I managed to salvage some of the backups I made about a year and a half ago. Because a year and a half ago, we had already done some of the projects that we did during the year where almost every month we did a series of projects. So I have some of those recorded and backed up. I managed to salvage some of those. But for anybody new joining in the middle of this or watching this later, one of the things we started this year was doing basically taking a existing fictional property, Jurassic Park, Terminator, those types of things, and sort of breaking them down into their constituent parts, using those for inspiration, and building something new from them. And we did that for a series of properties. I had a blast doing it. I wrote them all out on a text file on my computer, and then went on to doing some other projects for a little while, and had a major computer crash that obliterated the text file that I had been keeping my records on. But I have always been a advocate of the philosophy that if you give creative people the same building blocks, you'll get a different story from each of them. So I decided this was an opportunity to explore, because I can go back and watch the videos where I propose those ideas and just make notes off of those videos and get those ideas I had before. But it's been a few months. I've lost the ideas, except for the video records that I have. I kind of remember some of it, and retreading some of that territory again does bring some of them back to a degree. But that being said, this is an opportunity to give myself the exact same building blocks and see what I get the second time around, as if I were a separate artist. So exploring that, I've been going through the list of stories. We've done Ghostbusters, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So those are the last three that we've done. And this time around, we're doing Jurassic Park. I was looking at what was left on my list. We have League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Jurassic Park, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Stargate, Terminator, and Blade Runner. Now, to be fair, I could have chosen any one of those. Blade Runner and Terminator have some commonalities, specifically in the sense that we as humans create something else that is humanoid. So we've created a different race of beings, essentially. And they can play the role of our destroyer or our slaves. And that's sort of the same story from different ends. So I'm not sure where to go with that. You could do genetically engineered. You could, like, if you were to try to change the genre, I mean, there are some ways you could potentially do that. But when looking at some of the other options for stories to do today and tomorrow, I guess, I'm doing them about 2 days each. I was looking at the list, and I looked at Jurassic Park, and I'm like, what else could I do? And then I looked at Stargate, and I'm like, oh, maybe we could do time travel. I think that's something we thought about last time. I don't know if we went with it. Alternative realities, maybe. Looked back at Jurassic Park. I'm like, could we do prehistoric mammals? Maybe. I mean, I remember we talked last time about Jurassic Park. I do remember some of what we did last time for Jurassic Park was AI in a virtual reality park, and the AI is a fantasy wizards and monsters, and one of them learns how to use magic, which is just reworking the code, and swaps places with the player and leaves the program with the AI now inhabiting the brain of the person who was in there. And it proceeds from there as a story. Now, that's an interesting approach. I think one of the things that I was playing around with here, it just popped into my head, is what if it's not a different place or time? What if it's not like dragging something from ancient history? What if it's a different scale? And so I got to really think of like a different scale. Like, what if it was something like microbes or insects made giant? Now, you're getting sort of campy, silly, because we of the world generally understand that if you made certain life forms giant, they would collapse under their own weight. You could not build a giant praying mantis that's taller than a horse because they just can't support themselves. Not only can their structures not support themselves, but their method for breathing can't permeate all the cells of their tissues with oxygen because they don't use lungs to pump oxygen. They have more of a slightly more passive suffusion of their blood, and they don't have like a circulatory system like we think of. And the limits of the materials that they had available for these insects just wouldn't allow it to work that way. But what if we changed those rules a little bit? And so there's a part of me that thinks it would be fun to do a story with like the problem I have with this idea, that it's a fun idea. I like this idea. It could go far. It's not as rigidly scientific as, I mean, Jurassic Park isn't rigidly scientific, but it's one of those things where when we looked at the movie of Jurassic Park, if you look at the reptiles in there, they're not feathered, but it was one of the first ones that really gave us a chance to explore the idea of dinosaurs being descended from reptiles, or from birds, or birds being descended from dinosaurs. There we go. And it really gave us the chance to explore how those creatures would have worked in the world. And so that sort of curiosity and scientific nature is harder to do when you're setting out to do something that de facto breaks the laws of science. Like, you cannot make an ant huge and have it survive and like a 40-foot head to abdomen ant isn't going to have that proportional strength that an ant has on the micro scale. Like, the reason an ant can lift hundreds of times its own weight or 10 times its own mass in material is in part due to the scale it's working at. Once you get it to the large scale, it just doesn't work that way. But there's still a part of me that wants to find a way to make that work. I don't know if I want to do insects, because insects kind of have been, done the giant monster route before. But like the alternative that I was looking at were like bacteria and amoebas and microorganisms. And to be frank, they're weird, but they're not interesting. They're really not. Like, a giant bacteria is not a risk factor. Like, the thing that makes a bacteria dangerous is its ability to invade a host. But insects, I feel like there's got to be a way to do that. Like, there's got to be a way to make fleas and ticks and spiders and centipedes positively massive. I want the kind of thing that the smallest of the small creatures could easily be the size of one of those little breeds of dogs. And the biggest of those critters, like the Hercules beetles, they would be huge in comparison. They would be the size of a van or even an RV. But how would you do this? Like, we're already accepting the fact that we can't feasibly pass this off scientifically. Like, I could do something along the lines of somebody built a nanotech molecular assembler that can build synthetic versions of these things out of fullerenes and a lot of empty space, and use that as the excuse that you can build something that it might be the size of an RV but only weigh as much as a horse, and it can generate mechanical powers equivalent to the proportional strength of an ant. You could do something like that. But that's really pushing the edge of high sci-fi, where you're no longer talking about this is something that's happening on Earth in the next 20 years. This is something that's happening on some distant planet in the ages where humanity has grown to be immortal and have the ability to shape worlds and life forms at the whim of an individual mind. Somebody takes over a whole planet. It's their world. They can decide what they want to do, and they make a massive world park of giant insects. You can totally go that route. But that's not, I think, some of what made Jurassic Park as interesting as it is. I feel like the thing that made Jurassic Park what it was the sense that this is a little bit of the fantastic ages past brought back to life just off of the coast of modern day world. And I feel like that sense of wonder and amazement it's hard to achieve. It's hard to pull that off using modern technology, modern life forms, with modern understandings of how science affects that all. So there's a part of me that wants to say, like, okay, so we're gonna have to just move past that. So I'm not sure how. There's a part of me thinking in the back of my mind that you almost have to go pulp age fiction. So the ray gun gothic time period, the classic Superman Batman time frame, Doc Savage, The Lost World, Jules Verne kind of stuff. And in that realm, you have the possibility manifesting in those types of settings for mad science to make those things real. You could also go you could do mythology or fantasy where somebody uses magic. Not sure what to make of that. Like somebody who develops magic sufficient to enlarge insectile life forms. But see, like the world of magic already implies that you're just going to abandon the science of a thing. So there's no reason to say, like, well, we'll stick to spiders and centipedes and Hercules beetles. No, it's just, you just make a giant insect-like thing and just make that the thing. I'm not sure. We could, we could take it in a slightly, okay, so taking the idea of a Jurassic Park and instead of going back into history, you go down into scale. Taking insects and making them giant. Now, the thing that makes Jurassic Park in my head is this is the folly of science. We created a thing that was dead to the world, brought it back into our own time, and it gets out of our control. But what if it's not we create them? What if we find a way to open a doorway and it's not it's not about them being made real on our world. It's about us going to their world. So either we move to a universe where the laws of physics are different. So okay, so there are a bunch of ways we could potentially do this. So if we opened a portal to an alternate dimension, an alternate reality, where insects are able to grow to horse and elephant sizes. Hello. So this is the tricky one. We could do alternate realities. We could do the idea of transporting yourself to another planet with alien insects of super size. And it's tricky because like I said earlier with the thing that makes Jurassic Park work is the sense that, at least for the time it came out, that this was a more realistic scientific understanding of what dinosaurs would have been like. We've made them real. Now, subsequently, we've come more to understand that they likely had feathers and colorful plumage, and some of our assumptions were wrong. The tendency to think of them as cold-blooded, where they were pseudo-warm-blooded by some speculation, and the fact that they, like, the tendency to think of like the T-Rex as a major predator, and instead it's probable that they were a scavenger. They were probably more like the hyenas of the world. And we had a tendency at the time to stack things from different time periods. Like the distance between us and the last dinosaurs was probably not that different from the last dinosaurs and the first dinosaurs. So we have a tendency to lump them all together into one chunk. And a lot of the ones that appeared in Jurassic Park were not from the Jurassic period. So, like, yeah, they got some things wrong. But it was still always a sort of a story of scientists using more hard sci-fi like if we used a hard sci-fi, we could reasonably make a Jurassic Park thing happen. But like subsequently, it's sort of like where Asimov's robot stories, they were harder science fiction when they first came out than they are now. When we look at them now, we go like, yeah, no, that doesn't work that way. But for the time, they were harder science fiction. And so Jurassic Park was pretty close to hard sci-fi. I mean, we had just gone through a period of time where we understood the first cloning of sheep was happening. And so the idea that we could take genetic material and rebuild a new life form seemed practical. Like, it touched on breaking edge science that we understood at the time. And the problem is, if we're going to go with insects as our replacement for dinosaurs in this idea, then the problem we're going to have is real science just does not support such a thing. Now, could we make artificial ones? Yeah. Could we engineer a functional lung system inside a creature like a Hercules beetle that's the size of a van, so that it could breathe where its natural mode of breathing in the real world wouldn't work. Yeah, but then you're not creating the same insect. You're creating something entirely else that just looks like it. If we did a travel to another world or another planet, there is sort of the idea that if you do a story design that way, you have the possibility of, it's sort of like a joke in my head that I've thought about doing this with other story ideas, but if you have a doorway, like a special magical portal that you pass through, if you have this doorway where you enter this doorway, it's a 6-foot diameter circle, say, and you cross through that one and you exit one that is also 6 feet tall as far as you're concerned, but in truth, it's 6 millimeters tall, you're shrunk as you pass through to the other realm. So that's sort of why I think, like, if you did another world where scale and size are not the same, you could potentially do that. You could do, well, I mean, another pulp story that kind of does that is the early days of Superman, where the city of Kandor, I believe it was, where Supergirl comes from, was shrunken and put in a bottle. So it's an entire city slash planet put inside a bottle. And that bottle could be in Superman's Fortress of Solitude. So having that ability to cross the scale boundary makes it possible that you could use real insects. But I think part of the appeal of, I mean, I guess Jurassic Park includes the possibility of doing, like, Jurassic Park takes place on the island that they made it, and it's, you get there, you're checking out this novelty of a new park, and something goes wrong, you're trapped on the island, and you have to try to find a way to escape. And then it's, once you're escaping, the question of the things that live on that island, can they then break out and take over the whole world? You have half of that option available to you. You have the idea of, you can go to this park where you're shrunk and explore the creatures and the various insects and whatnot that live there. But if the walls around that park are broken down and the insects get out, everybody not in that park isn't threatened by an insect that's no bigger than the regular insect. Now, that doesn't necessarily kill this idea. So if we make this idea of somehow somebody figures out how to a way to build a wormhole, yeah, and that's the problem. We can't make giant insects. They can't breathe and they can't support their own weight. And that's part of the issue with trying to make a park full of giant insects that normal humans would populate or go to. Like, we can't do that without, like, no, I mean, that's part of the struggle that I'm dealing with right now. Is I love the idea of a giant insect park, but we can't make insects larger. That's why I'm saying, like, making that doorway be like a wormhole. We figure out how to make a wormhole, that lets us travel from one end of the wormhole to another. But if we make the other end of the wormhole dimensionally smaller, so that when we exit it, we are smaller too, that's a potentially viable. It's the one thing we have to suspend our belief on in order to make this work. Ooh, it does add a little quirk to this, though. One of the things that's interesting about this scale difference is an ant at our scale couldn't even support its own weight, let alone breathe, because its system isn't able to permeate itself with enough oxygen for it to survive. But it also collapses under the weight. Its skeleton just doesn't have the support it needs. An internal skeleton is what you need in order to support the mass of an insect that size. And so in order to make an internal structure on an insect to make it big, it doesn't work. And even if you did make it so that it could support itself, like I said earlier, an insect that size with an internal skeleton, and you made it out of Bucky tubes and made the other tissues foam, so the whole thing weighs 25 pounds, even though it's the size of a motorcycle, you could maybe do that. But the thing that makes an insect like an ant so fascinating is their ability to pick up things that are 4 or 5 times as big as they are. But if you make them our size, that proportional additional strength doesn't exist. It doesn't scale right. So they wouldn't be able to pick up anything huge or fascinating. They don't get to display their amazing powers of size. But if they remain their size and we move down to theirs, some of that stuff may switch over. Now you got to think, like, if they're our size, they lose the ability to move things bigger than themselves. If we go down to their size, do we gain the abilities of, say, Spider-Man? Like, can you imagine being their size and going to that space? It's like John Carter of Mars. When you see the movie John Carter, when he shows up on the desert plain and he doesn't know where he is, he stands up and, pushing himself off the ground, launches him through the air, because he's got the strength of somebody on Earth, but he's on Mars. The gravity's lower, so he's stronger. And so we're looking at something potentially like that here. John Carter could make huge leaps and he could fall from great heights, and the landing doesn't hurt as much. And so, like, that's actually a fascinating gimmick. Like, this makes up for having to create this portal to a smaller world. So we could feasibly use science to explain building a wormhole that's larger on one side than the other and allows us to transport ourselves into a smaller, it's basically a shrink ray. It's a shrink doorway, and you pass through that doorway and you're in a world of giant insects. They're the same size as they've always been. The insects going through that doorway in the other direction would immediately die. So there's not that danger of them escaping their habitat and overrunning the world as giant insects. There's no real danger of that. So if you built a park that's the size of a warehouse, or if you got a Disneyland size property and you built these insect terrariums and just filled it full of these insect terrariums, and then you set the entranceways as these portals to shrink you down to size. If somebody didn't go through one of the portals and broke in and set free all the insects in the terrariums, they would escape, but they would be regular sized insects. So it's not a huge problem. They're not going to destroy the world. But there is the possibility of people who have been shrunk getting out of the park through means other than those doorways. And then it's a question of like, now we have miniature people in the world. And they can jump and lift hundreds of times their weight. They're Spider-Man. They're miniature Ant-Men. Ant-Man and Wasp all over the world. You suddenly have a population. And that would be something as a consequence of the wormholes being collapsed, or people being unable to escape any other way other than to leave without going through the portals. So that possibility is still there for a little bit of it. I kind of like this approach to it. It still requires that we do the size changing Stargate technique. But I kind of think it works for me. I think the only thing that, and it's the science nerd in me, like, there are aspects I can nitpick on Jurassic Park too, where you really look at it and you go like, okay, so the idea that they bred them all as female and they used certain genetics from frogs, and frogs can switch to male, and thus they start breeding, and you have a stable population forming again. And it's like, I can nitpick that one out a lot. You could also do parthenogenically reproducing. They could have gone that direction, but they didn't. At any rate, the problem I have with my giant insect park is when you shrink the people going to the park, how many cells do I have in my body? All the cells that I have in my body on a microscopic scale have a equivalent cell size in the insects. When you shrink a person, their cells shrink. And there's a part of me that finds it super unrealistic to have somebody go from the size of a 6-foot man to a 6-millimeter man, and the scale difference of the cells in that man to the cells within an ant feel wrong. There's a part of me like that puts the cells of a human being almost on the scale of a virus, I think. Or even just a few strands of RNA. And that's just a rough estimate. If I ran the calculations, I'm sure it would be like preposterously wrong. But we may have to just let it go. There's just a part of me like, you just may have to let it go. Like Jurassic Park's velociraptors are bigger than velociraptors actually are. And they don't have feathers. So, like, there's a part of me. Yeah, and like, I don't know. I don't know how, like, we're not changing the cells. We're just transporting somebody through a wormhole. I don't think you can make that viably scientifically work. But there's a part of me that's just like, so freaking what? Like, let it go. If there's like one or two details of we have to figure out how to make a wormhole. And we have to let go of the fact that the shrunken cells wouldn't necessarily work right. Like, I will say, one of the things that's interesting is the size of a human cell is a certain size. Within a human being, we have a microbiome of other bacteria and spirochetes and fungi and things like that. And those things, there are millions more of those things within our own body than our own cells. But we're still, size-wise, if you took all the cells that are the bacteria in my biome and put them in a container, they would probably fill a space about the size of my head. But there are more of them than there are cells in my body by a large margin. And so the cells of bacteria are smaller than the cells of the human body. Okay, so the frog embryo thing might have done something to trigger gigantism. No. Yeah, there are a lot of caveats to the human body being shrunk. It's I think the thing we have to really build around is the premise that it's stupid and I hate it because my scientific brain gets angry about it. But on the scale that we're on, all of the cells, all of the atoms of the human body that passes through this, the atoms will be smaller. It's just such a stupid way to say it, but the atoms pass through this portal would be smaller. So the water's viscosity, all of the properties of the body would be scaled down to work at that size. So that, no worries, I'm usually able to follow pretty closely. The size and scale of, we're doing Honey, I Shrunk the Kids is what we're doing. We're just decreasing this, decreasing, what was it? The science they use in there is an atom is mostly empty space. So if we eliminate that empty space, you can shrink a thing. We're making BS science work for us on this scale. And it's the one thing we're doing to make this completely implausible. But at the same time, I want everything else to be fairly scientifically sound. So as we explore how we encounter the insects or the arachnids or the other invertebrates, that's not the right term for them. Why can't I remember the term for it? Arthropods. Something like that. As we encounter each of them, we want the history and the science of how they function to be real. Well, I mean, yeah, that's why the decreasing, removing the empty space between the nucleus and the electron, that's not safe. That's how you get nuclear reactions. And you're playing with the fundamental forces of science that don't work that way. Like, but I don't feel like we have to explain that all. Like, when you look at a movie like Marvel's Ant-Man and Wasp, nobody spends a lot of time explaining how this should work. Like, you just take it. Like, they're doing that. That's how that character works. And so I feel like there's this, when you look at science fiction, one of the things that's just sort of like, you just accept that their spaceships travel faster than the speed of light. They don't have to explain how they're doing it. But in something like, say, Star Trek, where they have their warp drive, they make an effort to at least give us sound. It's not magic. Warp speed is, theoretical physics dealing with how you might fold space-time through a hyperspace dimension. But nobody's explaining how that's reasonably achieved. It's a good theory of how one might be able to see a thing travel from place A to place B faster than the speed of light. But nobody's worried about how that would actually be achieved. And whether it's even practical to achieve that effect with science as we know it right now. We just have to include it at a certain point, saying like, look, if we're going to write these stories, we're going to have to make people travel faster than the speed of light. Okay, we accept that. Along with that, a lot of the things that other people don't realize are, it's called a suspension of disbelief. One of the other things in Star Trek that has to be put into place is there's an up and down. When you're standing on the bridge, there's gravity. Not only is there gravity, but it's not a spherical ship with a gravity towards a central core. It's like a building. There are layers of floors, and the gravity in the bridge and the gravity of the deck below the bridge don't counter each other. You don't have a floor that secretes gravity holding the people on the bridge down and the people on the deck below them up, so that their down is your up, and that floor between them is what's making that gravity. They don't do that. They just say it's stacked like a building with multiple floors, and there's a definite down direction. There's so much of a down direction that when their ship is hit, they shake and they fall because there's gravity for no apparent reason. They make these things and we just accept them because it's needed for the storytelling to proceed from there. And so I feel like what we're doing here is we're going, like, you can build a wormhole and you can, it's a reasonable to achieve the idea of a built wormhole. We don't know how scientifically we would achieve it right now, but we can work that detail out at another point. We don't even have to work it out in the story. It's one of those things that if there's enough fans of the setting, they'll explain it to the creators. Larry Niven did a Ringworld series of novels, and Ringworld is this giant ring around a sun, and the ring is made out of a material, and there are nerds who are fans of the series who bothered to calculate how that material would have to be made. So my sense of, and yeah, looking at your Babylon 5, they have a rotating gravity that works as a gravity, but they also use the gates that they travel through into hyperspace. And that's to me, that's a lot more realistic a means of doing faster than light travel. and gravity, but you still have aspects of that series and that setting that require a suspension of disbelief on some of them. And so I feel like we can kind of get away with the idea of saying, like, okay, somebody figured out how to create artificial wormholes. Their wormholes don't have to exit one side at the same size as they entered. So that's what we're going to go with. And once you're there, your internal structures operate under the science of how your internal structures, but your relationship to the outside environment can change. So basically, like we were talking about, what Ramius said about shrunk person's body liquids being beholden to issues of viscosity. If the properties of your matter stay the same, and at the same time your influences on the matter of the world around you change, I think that's viable enough. But here's the thing. We're writing fiction. This story we were working on yesterday was, what if board game characters and board game environments were made real? Nobody's going to nitpick the science on that one. You just let it go. So, I mean, fiction can be fun. And with the goofing around of just making a story and an interesting setting, we can just sort of like, we can fudge a lot of things. We don't have to be super serious about this. But I do still think it'd be a fun way to explore the world of arthropods. I guess it is. What is that? What it is? I should look that up. I can't keep saying it and pretend like I know what I'm saying. Yeah, anthropod. Arthropod. Anthro would be male. That's what I would, a human, like anthropomorphic. That's made to look human. Arthropod is what I'm looking to say. I knew it didn't sound quite right, but I knew I was close. Yeah, I think I made a joke yesterday about the chess board world. Can you imagine being a pawn on the game of chess and making it to the other side of the board and the consequences of that? But at any rate, yeah, we can just kind of blow past the scientific limitations on the size reduction. And we don't have to go too far into the idea of what happens to humans when they are left out of or they get out of the park. You get out of the park and you're stuck as a shrunken human being. Like, the only reason that I'm kind of curious about that is the potential of sequel stories. I mean, you have Jurassic Park, Jurassic World. What was the second one? Jurassic Park 2? Did they just call it 2? But I mean, you have the option of what does that mean going forward. I mean, it's the possibility, but as a, just setting out on the first story as a standalone, exploring the possibility of the story. And it's almost 12:30 here, so I should probably get ready to tie up for the night. But The Lost World, there you go. The idea that you could go further with it, we can get there later. We can leave the door open, is what I'm saying. We should be able to, go forward from there. Well, I think some of the thing that makes it interesting for me is when you start talking about making human beings small enough that the insect world is huge to them, you start looking at the possibility of humans shrunk in this manner are essentially brownies, fairies. You've turned into Tinkerbell. Maybe even a little bit smaller than that. Because I'm thinking, like, if you want like the biggest insects to be big in comparison to humans in a way that's sort of scary, like you could ride multiple people on the back of like a dung beetle or a scarab beetle and treat them almost like a elephant or bigger. But so if you're putting people at that scale, you've sort of got like the littles, I think, or the borrowers, depending on where you're from. They're like miniature people that lived in the walls of a house. So I do think there's definite potential for like future consequences and where that goes from there. And it gets you room to explore past the insects. You could go deal with what it's like to encounter birds, lizards, snakes, frogs and salamanders, amphibians of multiple size fish. So, I mean, I think there's potential for expanding past that point, but let's not build the sequels before we finished with creating the first one. So I think really that route is probably the best one. I was thinking about the alternative realities where like the laws of physics in another universe might be different enough to allow insects to become huge. Or an alien planet where alien physiology was so different that they were able to grow giant insects, and maybe gravity's lower, I don't know. But the scale, I think that's a viable option. Just artificial wormholes are the hand wavium, the suspension of disbelief, and the consequences on the human body being waved away just enough so that we can tell the story of a massive multi-acre insect terrarium park that people get caught in. So I think the thing I need to think about for tomorrow, and we'll discuss it more, I guess, tomorrow. It was sort of, yeah, essentially borrow a Stargate. I think the thing I have to figure out tomorrow is like the sort of history of the development of this idea. Because the other thing that comes up when you really look at Jurassic Park is somebody's made the joke recently multiple times is anybody who thinks that we are an intelligent species, like you have to realize there are people out there who for years are like, who would continue to try to build Jurassic Park after the first problem that happened? It seems like a horrible idea. We can't be that stupid. And then they take a look at the way we've been dealing with a pandemic in the world and go, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, I can see how we might be that stupid. Like, people wouldn't keep doing a thing if they thought it was going to kill them. Oh, right. Yeah. All the people going to the beach in the middle of a pandemic. Of course. So, yeah, there's definitely a sense of like, would we do something so stupid as to make a park where we make everyday insects dangerously, deadly, horrible giant monsters? Why would we do that? Well, because we're stupid. We're stupid as a species. So somewhere along the way, the technology to make this possible has to be created. And then somebody has to see the possibility of using this to do that with. So I think I'm going to have to invent the technology first and give it a mundane, stupid use beforehand, and then find a way for somebody to use it in a really stupid way. So I'll have to figure out how it comes to be that we have the ability to shrink or grow things. It has to be a technology being used to make electronics faster or something like that. I don't know. I'll play with it later. But that's what I'll have to come back and talk about tomorrow night, is how this all happens. You could shrink trash too, yeah. All right. I think there's got to be a better way to handle that. You could shrink nuclear waste. That might not be a bad thing to try to aim for. Like food, biodegradable material, compostable material, you don't want to shrink that. That's a valuable resource. And recyclable and raw materials that are usable, don't want to lose those too. But the other hazardous materials, maybe. So, all right. So I will come back tomorrow and deal with this a little bit more. I've got to go turn my AC back on because I'm starting to sweat. And then I will be back here tomorrow, probably around 11:30 again, to play a little bit more with this idea for a story. Until then, I will wish you a wonderful night. Until then, take care and have a good night. Golly, it's hot here tonight. Take care. All righty. Peace out, Boy Scouts.